So with today, I wanted to talk about period definitions. So, we'll get into the details of what those are here in a moment. But first, that's going to have to start with making a recording. I'm going to use our demo players here, which, if somebody doesn't know that we have those, in case you don't have any hardware available to you, you can still play around with some of the tools available in the software using these demo players here. So you just insert them into a hardware profile the same way that you would any of your other connected pieces of hardware. But as you can see, we've got motion, we've got pressure data, EMG data for various different types. And so those are always good to use if you want to just practice some of the skills or going through the workflow of the software. So we'll start with making a measurement here. And the idea with this type of demo data is to be able to see, an on-off pattern essentially. We're using EMG as our data, and so there's clear indication of signal going on, signal going off. You'll see this, of course, with any other signals, whether it's kinetics and you're looking at force curves, maybe somebody doing a squat or even jumping. With the kinematics, same idea, doing a squat or another type of cyclical movement where you're trying to understand, what happens either from each repetition or if we were to look at each of the repetitions overlaid on top of one another, what does that average curve end up reproducing? So with this, we've got our EMG data coming through, and I'm just going to make a quick recording for us to work with. But essentially what we're trying to identify is what these periods of movement are. And what I'll ultimately end up setting them up as is periods of activation indicated by the neuromuscular curves going up and down here, and then periods of rest, which would be those in-between periods. Typically, with any analysis, you're generally looking at those active periods and maybe want to disregard the periods of rest, for your analysis. And that's exactly what the period definitions allow you to do, is to essentially segment your data such that you can analyze only the portions of the recording that matter, or that are important rather to your test or your study, whichever it is that you're completing. So in this particular case, as we watched in the real-time scenario, you can see these on-off patterns going through. Let's think of these as maybe somebody doing squats, and we want to not only see what the difference is in the activation levels from rep to rep, but then we also want to look at the average shape of the curve and analyze them as if they were overlaid on top of one another. I'll show you two ways to do that within the software and the reports that can be used, and we'll also discuss just the general types of period definition options that there are, and then even some of the options that we've got for the automatic period definition, like for instance in the gait reports or the jump reports, for instance. So our first step in creating these periods, or at least accessing them, is going to the analysis report. So we follow our green action bar here to pick a report. The two types of reports that are generally used for period definition are the standard amplitude or the average activation report. And these elements are actually utilized across all of our different reports, whether it's with the myomotion module or the pressure or the force module. But we utilize this, this type of analysis kind of across the board. For instance, in the case of jump analysis, we utilize the standard amplitude options where we're looking at the individual jumps, and we want to see, the maximum or the mean or the particular calculated parameter for each one of those activities. And we want to see how it changes over time. The average activation, that type of report element is used, or average curve rather, is used across the board, especially in things like gait, where you have a cyclical pattern and you want to see what that average pattern looks like, what that, the general average curves and maxes and means and minimums are for that. And so those are adapted for all of the different reports that we have available within the software. Again, not only just in the myomuscle module that I'm working within, but also the motion, force, even some of the analog or the video reports that could be generated. I'm going to use the standard amplitude analysis for this first one just to go through the general concepts. One thing to certainly note for these reports is if you haven't already, you can look to the bottom left corner here and there's an info pane that's going to describe, what this report is, so a definition. But then the next section that shows up is what that period definition should be. So you can see in this particular case, it's recommending a period definition by markers in every other interval. That's going to make a little bit more sense here in a second when I transfer over to that screen. But further, you'll even see that there's some instructions, and this is exactly what we're going to be going over. So in the next screen, we can place some markers down at the beginning and the end of each one of those periods of analysis, and then use the period definition tools to be able to say, okay, I want to analyze this certain portion of data, skip this portion, analyze, and so on. So we'll select this report, click OK. We're going to analyze all three of our signals, so all we have to do is just press next. And now we get to the period definition tools. So I'm going to go ahead and just walk through each one of these just so everybody's got an understanding of what's available to us. And then we'll utilize one to proceed with the report. So the first and probably most commonly used is going to be by markers. And you'll see that this is the first selection box, and that's going to change what options are available to you down here. So by markers, so what does that mean? So that means that you would have placed or positioned markers at certain time points within the recording. You can see here that I'm laying down individual markers at the beginning and end of each one of these activation periods. And I'm doing so just by double clicking on the timeline. And that's positioning those markers across the recording that we have here. So if we want to define our periods by markers, we then have to decide how we want those periods to be defined. The first option here is every interval. So that essentially means that it's going to take into account where these markers are positioned, and then it's going to create an analysis period for every single interval that was created. If I select that and hit set, you can see here that it's just giving us the intervals between each one of the different markers. That's not exactly what we want to do in this case, because remember, we want to disregard that period of rest, which would occur between these two markers, for instance. So that being said, what are some of our other options? We have every other interval, which should give us what we want to see. It's going to skip the first interval, make an analysis, skip the next, make an analysis period, skip the next, and so on. So if I hit set for this, you can see that those rest periods now disappear, and only the sections between these markers where you see the yellow boxes here are what are going to be analyzed further. Some other options that can be used by the markers also include these intervals before, or interval after, or interval around markers. So you can create time points that you would like to use as those anchors, and then choose how that period's defined based off of where that marker is positioned. For instance, using an interval before, perhaps you want to say, let me analyze, if you only had one marker position, and let me just delete these real quick just so that we're working with a clean recording here. And how I'm doing that, just so everybody knows, is if you click and hold on the marker after seeing this little double arrow, you can drag down, and that allows the deletion of that particular marker. Let's say that there was just one marker placed at, generally the peak of the signal here. We could say, okay, interval before marker, I want to see, 0.2 seconds before that marker occurs for each one. So if I hit set, it's going to give me that time point, and it's using this marker that we had laid down to create that analysis period. So if I zoom in here, you can see that that's going to be roughly 0.2 seconds from that marker that was positioned. The same thing can be said, of course, for after marker. So in this case, maybe we want to see 0.2 seconds after the marker. So we can click set, and now that has transitioned from being in front, the period of analysis from being in front of the marker to now being afterwards. And then finally, we've got an around marker option. And so the same idea, you can say how much time you want it to be before the marker and how much time you want it to be after the marker. So we could do 1 second before and 0.5 seconds after. And when I hit set, now it creates this period of analysis for us around that marker. So here's our marker. And for instance, if we start from the front, that's about 1 second there. If we start from the end, about half a second there. And obviously I'm selecting from a little bit further past or before that interval there. So it's showing a different measure. Some of the other tools that can be used for markers is even labels. And, you know, for instance, let's say that we had a marker positioned and it was titled begin. You would be able to set periods using that, and you could have that as being one of the markers available in your list here. And then you could have a specific end period marker that you also have in this list. And so then when you hit set, it would only create intervals between that begin and that end marker that you have positioned. So using specific labels to perhaps, you know, identify certain periods of measurement as opposed to just the general marker names that you see listed here. Next option would be using the minimum and maximum of a particular trigger channel. This can be something set up with, you know, an EMG channel, one of the motion channels, a force channel, or if you have a sync signal or some sort of switch that's integrated into your measurement, you can use the minimum and maximum of that particular signal to define your periods of measurement. So for instance, in this particular case, as you can see, there's different options, minimum to minimum, maximum to maximum, so on. We're going to use this minimum to maximum. So we should see a marker positioned for each one of these intervals at a minimum value before and then at a peak value for each one. And we're using the glute med signal, so this top EMG signal here, as our default or reference channel. So when I hit set, you can see how it creates the different periods of measurement for each one of the channels here. And so for instance, in this particular case, if we look at this first period, it's going from a minimum value to the maximum value for that particular signal. And then it finds the next minimum and the next maximum and proceeds down the line here. You can also even change how those thresholds are defined. So you can say that I actually want my minimum threshold to be defined as, you know, 50 microvolts. And then you can hit set and see how things adjust from that point forward. Otherwise, the automatic is just going to automatically detect a minimum value and a maximum value for you. The next options would be the rise and fall by trigger channel. So same idea, you have a particular channel that you want to use, and you want to use the rise of the signal, so as the signal's going up, and then the fall of the signal to define that particular period, so the signal going down. Of course, this works best with you know, sinusoidal type signals that you're seeing here, so something that has a clear up and a clear down pattern. Signals that may maintain or stay on for an entire period may not be the best channels to use for those reference periods. So just be conscious about which one you use, which channel you use to define those particular periods. But again, you know, we can select this and there's a couple different options to use. And, for instance, what I'll use in this case to define the on and off periods for each one of these muscles is a rise to fall. So the little icons give you an indication about how that sets up, where essentially we would have a period of rest, and then a marker or the period would be defined as when that signal is active, and it would end when that signal becomes inactive. So same thing, I'm going to choose my glute med as my trigger channel, click OK. And then sometimes with these, you would change, how your different thresholds are defined. You can do a relative option between the minimum and maximum. If I scale this out, you'll be able to see that, between the minimum and maximum. You can do absolute values as well. So where do you want the rise and the fall to occur for that particular channel? And then there's also this minimum duration that can be set. And essentially what that is saying is that these conditions need to be met for at least this amount of time for the software to consider that an adequate place to place down a marker or create that interval of measurement. I'm going to do the relative option here, and we're just going to do 10% between the minimum and the maximum. So when I hit set, we should see how that changes some things, right? It defines that, shows even some options here where it's creating some interesting intervals, right? This isn't what we want to measure. So this is where you can start to play around with some of these to see how they affect. For instance, if we do 1%, we can see that, oh, okay, there actually is not a 1% between the minimum and maximum. So it's giving us this option here that there's no periods that can be defined. Let's say we increase it to 50%. How does that affect it? Same thing. So we're just getting some different periods that you want to be able to try to affect using this information. The other thing, but again, you also have to look at where it's being defined on your signal. So in this case, glute med is our particular signal that we're working with. We can also make effects on this by changing this anti-rattle. So if we switch it to 0.2, didn't really do too much, but if we change it to 0.5, maybe there's not even an option. Or sorry, if we go lower, I guess. So it just keeps adding even smaller intervals, which you can see here. If I zoom in, it just created an even smaller interval there. So with the rise and fall channels, you just want to be particular about one, again, which channel you're using as your trigger channel, and then can those minimums and maximums actually be described. So for instance, maybe I actually choose an absolute value instead. So I'll do, roughly 40 microvolts for the fall and 40 microvolts for the rise as well. So if we do 40 and 40, let's see. So that looks like pretty good periods of measurement, right? You can see them positioned on either side of the curves that we're getting for that glute max there. Moving on to the report though, this is where we start to define or where these measurement periods actually make sense. So in this case, we've got the activation patterns here where we want to analyze what's going on in between these active portions and disregard, these different rest periods. And for this particular report, we're looking at individual repetitions and how things might change as time goes on. So now that I've got my periods defined, I can click next, and this is what would bring me to this report. So if I zoom in here, we can see that each one of the repetitions is shown to us as a period. And then even up above, it shows you where those periods actually exist. So using another report, as I mentioned, we do have some other options. We can use the average activation report. There's going to be some different things that are available to us with this report because it allows us to actually establish an event with the markers as opposed to just using the starting and ending points to essentially signify a repetition. But this allows us to understand, okay, if there's something that occurs or we want to signify that there's something occurring within this activation, separating it to a two-phase analysis, we can take a look at that. So again, same options, by markers, by marker labels, by min and max trigger channel, by rise and fall trigger channel. But you'll see that there's some different options. So for instance, with the markers by label, there's now this period event. So that's indicating that time point that something might happen. The best description of that would be, again, in like a squat, for instance. You've got two phases of movement. You've got the eccentric and the concentric movement for the squat, with that period, or sorry, that event being the amortization phase, or that middle point when you're transitioning. So if I were to go through and lay down markers at the beginning, end, but then also at that middle or event portion, we can use that third or middle marker to signify the separation of these two different phases. And how I would then analyze that from a report standpoint would be using the markers, and then I can say every interval with event, or I can do even every other interval with event. So for instance, if I select this, you can see here that it's giving us, in this case, I have them labeled eccentric and concentric, but it's showing us one phase, the eccentric movement for our example, this middle event, which is that first or that amortization phase, and then the concentric phase of the movement coming down from the activation pattern here. So this report and these types of markers are used to allow you to understand bilateral phases or two-phase movements. This is also something that you see in the gait reports when it's separating the stance and the swing phase. But again, it's about it using the different marker options to essentially either define, the entire interval, as we did before with the previous report, or the two-period or two-phase measurement period, as we're doing now with this report. If I click next, since we have our repetitions marked out and the periods defined here, we can see that now is providing me with this average curve. So this is each one of those periods overlaid on top of one another. You can see our two phases of the measurement period indicated here as well. And then within this type of element, it now normalizes the time so that we're looking at it from a 0 to 100% of this movement as opposed to the actual time point in seconds. What this allows for, though, is an average understanding of that curve. So again, for these types of cyclical movements, walking, running, squats, anything that is in this repetitive nature, this is where those periods really come into play. In this particular example, you can see now that we've got the average curve shown by the solid line here, one standard deviation from the mean representing that shadow around it. So it gives us an understanding of that variability of the signal through those different movements. And then we use the markers to define the two phases. Obviously, the difference here is we don't get to see the individual reps and what the difference is over time, but we still do get to understand some statistical parameters based off of that average curve that's generated with each one of the repetitions overlaid on top of one another. So those are the general reports that are utilized with these types of markers, but there's also ones that utilize some more automatic marking. And those would be gait reports, jump reports. And so if we take a look at an example of that, and if I open a jump analysis, for instance, one thing you can see about this is, for instance, we've got a little bit more periods to define because we want to understand, okay, when are they loading, when are they in flight, and when are they in landing? So some of our reports actually use signals to automatically define those periods. And so it makes it a little bit easier because they automatically take in that data. We've programmed it such that it will recognize those signals and the certain patterns of those signals to be able to define the particular periods of measurement. Load, flight, landing. But just to give you an example of showing you how this actually operates, it's very similar to what we just saw previously. So for instance, this is our average curve. So very much the same thing that we saw with that other report, except rather than from being a 2-period or 2-phase measurement, it's actually a 3-phase measurement. So it's just adding another set of a phase to understand the data within each one of those periods as an average signal. The other scenario would be a gait analysis. And, you know, for instance, let's take a look at somebody running with the motion system on. I know this is what a lot of folks have. So first, you know, what's neat about the motion system is that we're able to establish these contacts. And so we can use the signals from the feet sensors primarily to understand when the foot is on or off the ground. And that's indicated or set up rather by clicking this button beneath the motion avatar. So this show contact signals here. But when that's set up, we now have our contacts that we can use to define these periods of movement. So in the case of running a gait analysis report for this particular record, we would follow our green action bar here. We'll choose our running report for this particular example. And we first, you know, we can select what signals we want to push through. I'll just keep it with the EMG for right now. But then we have our options for setting our periods. Again, they're the same ones that you saw previously, but you're just using a particular signal to actually define those different periods. So in this case, we want to set it up as a rise to rise. And I know that this is obviously, I've already run this report with this recording, so it's already defining them for us. But the reason that we're doing that is because, again, this is a biphasal or 2-phase movement. We've got stance and swing phase. And we can use these trigger signals to understand when stance and swing phase exists. So stance phase being when you see this square wave on, and then swing phase being when it's down at 0. So just as the icon indicates here, we've got our event, which is the falling side of this square wave here, indicating toe off. And our 2 periods would be, our 2 phases rather, are stance phase and swing phase, also shown down here. We just have to tell the software what signals we want to use to define those periods. And so with this particular report, it guides you a little bit further. So it says, set up your left periods. So with that, we would use our left contacts, and we can click, select that and click set. Perhaps if I only wanted to do just a short selection of data, you know, maybe this middle portion, I can click, hold, and drag over the data to make that selection. And then when I hit set, it's only going to set the periods within that selected portion of the recording. But you can see how it used this contact switch for the left side to actually define those periods. And when I click down here, you can see how they're actually positioned. So we've got the stance phase in this dark red going from when this signal's on, and then the swing phase when the signal's off. If I click next, I can do the same thing for the right periods, except again, I want to just make sure that my trigger channel is set to the correct one. So the contacts of the right, hit set, and then same idea. You can see how it only set the periods for that selection. Now with my periods defined though, I can click next, and not only is it going to produce some, you know, temporal gait data in this particular example, but then it's giving us an understanding of that EMG activation. What do those patterns look like as they relate to this biphasal measurement that we're seeing here? In this particular case, as many of you are familiar, this left side is that initial contact. So essentially where that first square wave, where the rising edge of that square wave existed, stance phase goes through that entire activation, if you will, of that square wave. And then the falling edge indicates the toe off. And then we've got our swing period that happens until that next rising edge of that square wave is seen. And that's what allows us to do the average analysis of this particular setup here.